Okay, so Pam, you worked at Barnados
Hmm.
in Woodford.
Yeah.
Just tell me from the beginning, how did you get the job, and what was that experience like?
The job originally was advertised in the local paper, didn't go through trade papers in those days, and I applied and I was interviewed for Barkingside, which was called the Australasian Medical Unit, and that was the baby unit for Barnados. And we had a link there because my aunt had been a teacher in the village. So I went for the job. I mean, they were absolutely desperate. They hadn't had a junior for a couple of years. There was a gentleman there, Mr. Dronsfield, his name was, and Barbara Doyle was my boss, my manager. And just say she'd worked extensively in America. So it became very obvious that they wanted me to work under supervision, but in the other schools as well. So I learnt to drive very quickly and passed my test and went out there. So that was the beginning. I loved working with the babies. It was mostly spina bifida in those days. There were epidemics of spina bifida. We still had thalidomide children when we were in John Capel because of the age group. And there were other conditions that were relatively common in those days that we don't see
So, what
now.
year was this that you
This
started
was
working there?
the December 71. I went to work there. A lot of the children were in care, which surprised me because I always assumed that Barnado children were orphans, but they weren't. Some were, and for some children, Barnados had full responsibility. So in other words, if the children needed any operations, procedures or whatever else, Barnados signed. And certainly in John Capel, Hanbury, there were two ladies called Janet and Beryl, and they were what we would have called in those days spinster ladies. They'd obviously dedicated their lives. They lived upstairs in one of the I suppose they were flats. I don't know. I don't ever remember going up there. But they lived up there. I presume that looking back, I presume they were an item, but that's neither here nor there. They were lovely, lovely ladies who dedicated their lives, and they were probably in their early 40s at that time. I don't remember their names. Beryl Homden, that's it. Beryl Homden rings a bell. Anyway, so they were the nurses, and they were matrons, so they were in charge of the home. And then, of course, there was a school because the kids obviously lived and just literally went along the corridor to get to the school. And the head of the school was a lovely lady called Rosemary, whose surname I don't remember now. And she had a staff of, I think, probably 5 or 6 teachers, maybe less. There were obviously teaching assistants in the classrooms. They didn't have names in those days as teaching assistants. And, of course, there was no inclusion in those days, in as much as the Education Act hadn't happened yet. Children didn't go to mainstream school with a disability. I mean, subsequently, I went to work at the local special school where they had children with asthma were in special school. So it was all very different. So yeah, I mean, the kids were looked after by house parents. I remember at the time being told that I mustn't be called Pam. I must be called Mrs. Ebden, I was then, because it generated respect amongst the house staff who were my age anyway, and I disagreed with that totally because I thought that was rubbish. You don't get respect by being called by your surname. You gain respect in many other ways. So my boss, Barbara Doyle, and I had lots of things. I mean, I was wet behind the ears, but there were lots of things that I disagreed with her on, and looking back, I still would, with hindsight. So that was it. I mean, the children had lots of activities. They used to be taken out. Some of them would see their parents, who would come. Some of them never did. A lot of the children had lots of other problems. They'd maybe been in failed foster care, I remember.
What was your relationship like with the children?
Barnado's children were very different to any other. And when you first arrived, they would welcome you like a long lost friend and made you feel so welcome, and they clung like limpets. And then when the next person came, they'd drop you like a hot brick. And that is the casualty of growing up in care, as I understood it, and what people used to say to me. Because you'd any stranger walked in the door and you would be just deluged by children running towards you and hugging you and wanting to kiss you and wanting to be picked up.
Is that because they thought you might have come to foster or adopt them?
No, I don't think that was in their little minds. I think it was just the fact that their ability to form relationships and to have normal relationships had been severely damaged. And they'd been picked up and dropped on so many occasions. Maybe they were hanging on or clinging to something. But it was the novelty as well, and you might bring them something, and strangers often came and they brought treats or they brought sweets or they brought clothes. I mean, there were a lot of voluntary organisations who used to come with things to bring us. I remember we used to get boxes of stuff. I think there was a shop called Pollard's years ago. It was like a cheap shop, I suppose, like, well, no, Primark, I mean, it was lower grade than that much. But I remember boxes of stuff coming. I don't know how it arrived or whether it was voluntary, people had come voluntary or somebody had bought it. I don't know, but I remember these boxes coming. I think, that was indicative of children in care. And I think it is very difficult for them to make and sustain relationships.
Were you there every day?
I was at John Capel Hanbury. I used to come out here 2 afternoons a week. So I would have been at John Capel Hanbury, I think, probably the bulk of the week. I think I used to go to the AMU on a Monday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday I would have been at JCH, as we called it, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I'd have to think about that one, Deborah. I know Tuesday and Thursday afternoons I used to go from John Capel Hanbury to here at lunchtime and spend 2 afternoons here because it was a smaller unit with children with fewer disabilities that were treatable by physiotherapists, and normally the bulk of physiotherapy work is done with young children.
You were a physiotherapist?
I was a physiotherapist,
You were
physiotherapist. That was my role.
Did you stay in contact with any of the children, or did you ever know what happened to any of the children?
Yes, in as much as there were a couple of the kids who, when New Mosford disbanded in whenever it was in the 90s, came to the local school that I was working in, which was Ethel Davis in Chadwell Heath.
Oh my goodness.
There were a couple of kids, one girl who I did become very friendly with, a little girl, well, I say little, she had a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bones, so she stayed the size of a 2-year-old or 3-year-old with very broken, very great deformities. And we stayed friends, and in fact I took her to the cinema a few times, and I remember sitting on the bus with her because she just used to lift her up. Before I had my kids, that would have been, I suppose. I remember sitting on the bus and somebody saying, oh, isn't she sweet? How old is she? And she piped up, she said, what do you think I am? Bloody deaf. She was 7 or 8 at the time. But there were a few kids that were there. There was also a project, there was another project of children living in a home environment. There was a group of kids, there was this Melanie, there was a girl called Anne, there was somebody called Martin Buckland. God, how these names come back to me. And I've seen him in Hainault some years ago as a man in a wheelchair. But there were 6 kids who were part of an experiment, inverted commas, where they lived in Barkingside, but they were schooled into John Capel Hanbury because Barkingside didn't have a school for them.
Right.
So they were living with house parents, male and female house parents. Charlotte was one. I can't remember the others. I can see them, but I can't remember their names. There were a number of house parents, and they lived I don't know, a normal life, but a family life. 6 kids, 4 house parents who were obviously on rota, and they were bussed into school.
Okay, and did you see that there was a difference between the development of those children and development of the children that were actually at John Capel?
Difficult to say because it was newly established when I arrived, and I was fresh out of college, next to nothing really, although you think you know it all, don't you? But actually they would have been chosen for the qualities that enabled them to live side by side with the house parents. So it's difficult to know whether they were the right kids who went into that environment or that environment made them the right kids. I don't know.
Do you think Barnados was a good place? Well run?
What was the alternative?
Good question.
The people who were there, for the vast majority of occasions, were wonderfully dedicated, highly professional in their roles, but very, very caring and understanding as surrogate parents or substitute parents. There were some things that were weird. I remember one boy, I mean, you don't want names, presumably,
No.
do you? But he had a hemiparesis. He was paralysed down one side, and he had a raft of behavioural problems. And he was reaching sexual maturity at about sort of 13 or maybe 12, I'm not sure. But they were very worried about how things were going to be. And at that time, the main hospital that Barnados related to was Queen Elizabeth in Hackney and can't remember the other one. Duncan Forrest was the surgeon, but it was sort of Westminster. I think it might be in Westminster Children's Hospital, actually, thinking about it. Okay, so they recommended that he had a frontal lobotomy. And that was what they did. Now, he was a Barnado child, and Barnados signed that form. He had no parents. And you look back and you think, was that experimental? Was he used as a guinea pig? He had no advocate to, as far as I'm aware. And that was all these things are my perceptions, aren't they? I mean, I can only report it as I saw it then. But he was a lot better. He was totally and utterly changed. His personality was he was calm, he was manageable, he was placid, he was bland.
Right.
And that was how he ended up. But having said that, it possibly was better than if he'd have committed sexual offences, been highly violent as a teenager and ended up in prison. So you don't know, do you?
No, you don't.
But that would have been, I left I actually left the day that, what's her name, got married. Princess Anne married Mark Phillips in November 1973. And that was the day I left. They had a big party for the royal wedding. And that was my last day working there. They incorporated me in the party. I think it was the 15th of November, something like that. And he'd been operated on, I think, during that summer holiday.
Overall, but your experience there was good, though. It sounds as if the experience was very good, and
It was very good. I learned an enormous amount. There were certain philosophies, things like my boss wanted children to walk properly with calipers and sticks, like a stick and a leg and a stick and a leg. And I felt then, and carried on all through my professional career, believing that childhood is for children. And so if a child wanted to scamper around on two crutches, swinging their legs through, so be it. And she would turn around and say, but when he's 16 and he's not walking properly, he's not going to thank you. And I'd say, when he's 16, he's going to be too heavy to be on his crutches, and he's going to be a wheelchair user, and he'd keep up with his mates. And believe me, that was what had happened. And so all through when I was working, when kids would get bigger, I was not quick, but I always held this philosophy: offer a wheelchair to the child and the parents, because they can keep up with their mates and they can skim down the road far quicker than doing this perfect walking that gets them nowhere. So that was we used to have blows about that, which was quite interesting.
But for all that,
it was a good time. I think. I mean, you look back and the kids were in special school, the kids were in an orphanage. It was terrible for them, but it was the best we had. And it wasn't until 1981, when the Children Act, or the Education Act, came about, and children started to be incorporated into mainstream school. And obviously all the problems that caused, and the changeover was so slow, and people tearing their hair out because they couldn't get the services for the kids that they wanted. So things have changed massively over time.
But overall,
I think it was a good time. I certainly wouldn't have slated it, but then I think I have that kind of personality anyway. I don't go into things looking for negatives. I never have. I'm blessed with a very positive attitude, and I think that's just pure luck. I don't think it's anything else. I mean,
I would agree with you.
I'm a half full person. I've never been a half empty person.
So, all in all, the experience was a good one. Thank
I
you.
would say so.
Thank you so much. It's been very enlightening. Very enlightening. I really can't thank you enough.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you.